call it racism when it's really not racism, something that doesn't exist, never has existed, and because it doesn't exist, we can't solve it. Why not call it what it is?
So you actually think racism has never existed?
Right.
The concept of racism came into existence during the 16th and 17th century when white Europeans on this land made a distinction between slave and slave owner. They socially split the human race into smaller racial categories based on an outward skin color. The categories were said to be scientific, they weren't, and they said the black race was inferior as a way to justify their enslavement. The concept of racism definitely exists and has been put into practice since the inception of this country. Jesse Lee Peterson just denies it.
Do you think you could trace your family history back to a thing called slavery, or is that my imagination?
I can. A matter of fact,
so you don't think slavery was racism?
No.
You weren't, your parents...
Because there were black people who owned slaves as well.
That's not my point.
We can only talk about this in the historical context of the history of this country, because as I assert, this country was built on racism, or what I call white supremacy, which is white people are superior and therefore should rule over non-white people. Jesse Lee Peterson believes since black people owned slaves, it wasn't racist. It's not who owns slaves, it's who's permitted to be slaves. In this country, there were no legally held white slaves. The who was permitted to be slaves only went one way. Therefore, slavery in this country was racist.
The point is, why were you a slave?
Because they just happened to own me. But let me tell you
But
this.
it had nothing to do with your race.
Well,
is there a reason why the preponderance of slaves in America, they were just accidentally black?
But you know, white people have been enslaved as well by other whites, right? And then blacks have been enslaved by other blacks. In parts of Africa,
That's right.
they're still is that racism?
Probably not, no.
Yes or no?
I said probably not.
I know, but I need a yes or no. You're a pastor, so I want to try to help people.
Yeah, I understand that.
Is that racism when blacks enslave other blacks? Yeah.
No, that's not racism. I don't know if Jesse Lee Peterson is confused or he plays dumb to confuse his audience. He wants to know if black people enslaving other black people in Africa is racist. He must be confused by the act of slavery to ask such a stupid question. Slavery is the act. The reason behind making a slave is what would make it racist. In other words, the institution of slavery, one person owning another person, as he talked about in Africa, isn't racist. The institution of slavery in this country was racist because black people were said to be inferior, therefore could be owned as slaves, is the reason it's racist. So here's what his question actually sounds like to illustrate my point on how dumb it sounds. Were black people in Africa enslaving other black people because they thought other black people in Africa were a different race and inferior? It's nonsensical. The answer is no.